Now, the 10p starting rate of income tax was abolished by Labour 6 years ago. Now they say that was a mistake by Gordon Brown, and they want to bring it back. The pledge would be funded by a new mansion tax on homes worth more than £2 million. The party's leader, Ed Miliband, claimed the change would leave 25 million taxpayers better off. The Tories, though, accused Labour of cobbling the idea together overnight. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
So what is this?
It's a policy. David Cameron accused Labour yesterday of not having any of them. And today, Ed Miliband and Ed Balls unveiled two. They'd bring in a mansion tax and reintroduce the 10p tax rate. The very policy their political patron, Gordon Brown, abolished 6 years ago.
I said to Gordon Brown in 2007, before that budget, it's the wrong thing to do. Ed Miliband said to Gordon Brown, before the 2007 budget, it's the wrong thing to do.
Labour said it would levy a mansion tax on the 70,000 or so houses worth more than £2 million. Every year, the owner would pay 1% of the value above £2 million. That would pay for reviving the 10p tax rate, but it would only bring in enough to pay for a small band, around 10 to 11,000. Independent estimates suggest it could put about £80 a year in your pocket.
The mansion tax and the 10p, it sends a signal which says, look, you know, nobody wants to raise taxes on some people, but at a time when houses over £2 million are significantly undertaxed and people are really struggling and living standards are falling, this is the right and the progressive choice.
Labour acknowledges the sums involved here are not seismic, but they hope they're giving an indication to voters of where they'd like to take tax policy if they were elected. Special lower rates of tax have proved quite attractive to politicians. They've been brought in and then done away with twice in the last 4 decades. They're less popular with economists.
It is symbolism. It will not do a huge... It will make the tax system a bit more complicated and a little bit more progressive, but it won't have very much macroeconomic impact.
If you want to reduce income tax for low earners, you can achieve an almost identical result much more simply by increasing the tax-free allowance, as indeed the coalition has been doing. Actually, if you really wanted to help the lowest earners, the better way would be to increase the national insurance threshold.
Labour admits its mansion tax could end up a direct copy of the policy the Liberal Democrats had in their last manifesto.
It's the right thing to do. And I think what's happening at the moment, we're getting a lot of rich foreigners buying property in the south of England, driving up prices so that local families can't get property. I mean, it would be a very sensible thing to do.
We'll discover over the course of the day all sorts of problems and issues with a policy that looks like it's been cobbled together overnight.
So it doesn't worry you?
No.
Some Tory MPs had hoped their leader might revive the 10p tax band. Ed Miliband hopes he's signalled to voters that he knows their incomes have been squeezed and he'll redistribute what he can to ease the pain.
Well, I'm joined now by Chris Leslie from Labour's Shadow Treasury team and from Westminster by the Treasury Minister Sajid Javid. Well, Chris Leslie first, it's quite a mea culpa on the 10p tax rate, but I mean, of course, it was all Gordon Brown's fault, wasn't it?
Well, look, I mean, it's important to acknowledge mistakes and show that you've learned lessons of the past. And,
as long as you can dump it on the previous leader.
No, I think it's important to say what we should have done was keep that 10p tax rate. Actually, now, if we could afford to do it with this mansion tax on properties over £2 million, using that revenue to help people who are either low-paid or middle-income earners, that has to be the priority for the tax system. And the message that Ed Miliband is sending today is about the choice that people will face at the next election. It's about the decisions that you can take between having an unfair tax system that gives a massive tax cut for millionaires, about £100,000 in April, as Sajid wants to do, or doing something to hopefully help people on those lower earning levels feel better off. And that is really, really important.
I just want to put that point to Sajid Javid. A tax cut for 25 million Britons is a heck of a lot fairer than a £40,000 a year tax cut for people earning £1 million a year.
Well, first of all, Labour have absolutely no credibility on this issue, as your report has just shown.
But could you just answer that point for me, please, on fairness?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right that a tax cut for 25 million people is more credible, and that's what our personal allowance increase has delivered. In fact, our personal allowance changes that we already implemented have made sure that the people that lost out most when Labour abolished the 10p tax rate have gained a lot more because of the increase in the personal allowance we instituted. Furthermore, not just 25 million people...
Let me just put that point to Chris Leslie then. the coalition's effectively doing this already.
And some of those personal allowance changes, I think, are important. We would want to build on that with this 10p rate, because this is about a progressive tax system. What you don't do is prioritise the sort of trickle-down economics where you give this massive tax cut in April, this coming April, to those very, very wealthiest 1% in society, and of course at the same time cut the tax credits, raise VAT on everybody else. This is the difference between the parties now. It's about fairness versus the same old Conservative approach that we've had from the Conservatives, which, by the way, isn't actually solving our economic problems. It's not getting growth, and the deficit is getting worse, not better.
Well, Sajid Javid, how do you answer the fairness point?
Well, the difference between the parties, if that's what, that's the phrase Chris used, is that we're getting on with the job of, first of all, cleaning up the enormous mess that Labour left behind, which isn't easy by any estimation, but at the same time, we're finding money in the public purse to help the lowest paid. Tax cut for 25 million people, 2 million people taken out of taxation altogether.
OK, but it's all very well to blame Labour for our economic woes, but I mean, you are presiding over the biggest fall in living standards, in living memory, as the Governor of the Bank of England put it. People are starting to lose confidence in your handling of the economy.
Well, I don't think that's how the Governor of the Bank of England put it, but you are right to point out...
He said exactly that. He said real take-home pay has fallen by more in the past 2 years than in any time in living memory.
Well, the important thing is that whilst we're trying to deal with the mess that we've got, we're also trying to do what we can to help the people that are being squeezed the most. And that's by changes in the personal allowance, which are these tax cuts for 25 million people. We've capped council tax increases. We've also kept interest rates low by having a credible economic policy, unlike the previous economic policy.
But why, Cathy, do people feel as though they're working longer and longer hours, but their wages are getting less and less? Their living standards are really being squeezed. And, the key question Sajid is going to have to face at the next general election is, do people feel better off in 2015 than they did in 2010. Sajid, can you promise that living standards will be higher in 2015 than they were at the last general election?
Well, I mean, first of all, Chris
can you answer that question first, though?
Well, no government can promise what will happen in the future. Of course not. What people want to know is that they actually have a government in power that is taking tough decisions and dealing with the mess that they were inherited.
The deficit's going up, Sajid. The deficit is rising.
The deficit is down 25%.
On the deficit, though, let's just tackle that point on the deficit, because you've admitted that you've made mistakes on the 10p tax. You've also admitted mistakes on bank regulation. Why not go the whole hog and admit that you made mistakes on paying down that deficit?
Look, we've accepted that some of the mistakes that were made in the past, but it's important also for governments to accept they make mistakes too.
But you haven't admitted that you made mistakes on the deficit. You went into the financial crisis with a higher deficit than any other country in the G7, a higher structural deficit. That is categorically the case.
Everybody knows that it was the banking crisis, which of course required...
This was before the financial crisis.
You deny that it was anything to do with the banks, Sajid. Then you're rewriting history completely. Of course we had to bail out the banks.
This was before
of course
the
it affected our
crisis.
revenues. If you want to talk about mistakes, we should have been regulating the banks more effectively. But I didn't hear Sajid saying more regulation was necessary. He was saying regulation was the bad thing. So acknowledge the mistakes from your part too, please, Sajid.
Final quick point from Sajid Javid.
Yes. Regulation. Let's talk about regulation.
Labour
misregulated the banking system, spent billions, 65 billion on rescuing just 2 banks. If we'd had that money now, imagine what we could have done to help the lowest paid in society.
You wouldn't have rescued the banks.
Sajid Javid, Chris Leslie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.